It began as a whisper. In Colorado Springs, neighbors would later say there were rumors about Kimberly Singler long before police lights ever touched the street. Quiet talk about a marriage that had unraveled behind closed doors. An estranged relationship strained by separation. A custody battle that, according to those close enough to notice, had turned tense and deeply personal. Nothing loud. Nothing public. Just the kind of rumors that live in lowered voices and unfinished sentences. Then the night arrived. In the early hours, long after the house had gone dark, that tension, once invisible, suddenly mattered. What had been confined to court filings, private arguments, and whispered concern would collide with something far more permanent. Because while the marriage was ending, the battle over the children was not. And before dawn, before explanations, before anyone truly understood what had happened inside that home, a discovery would be made that would turn those rumors into something far more disturbing. Something that could never be taken back. Stories like this don't reveal themselves all at once. If you step away now, you'll miss the moment when everything stops making sense. Subscribe, because the truth in cases like this only shows itself to those who stay. It was just after 12:30 a.m. on December 19, 2023, when the Colorado Springs Police Communications Center received a call that would forever change a quiet apartment complex on Palomino Ranch Point. The voice on the other end reported a burglary. Someone inside the home had been attacking the family. Officers immediately dispatched units to the address. When officers reached the residence, they were met with an interior that seemed eerily silent, too silent. At first glance, nothing about the home matched the chaos one would expect from a break-in. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry. Yet the sense that something was profoundly wrong weighed heavy in the air. Officers found 35-year-old Kimberly Singler near the entrance, injured, and her 11-year-old daughter also hurt. But the bedroom down the hall told a darker story. A 9-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, both lifeless. The room felt staged in its stillness. Toys sat in place. Blankets folded back. No sign of struggle, and yet, the absence of normalcy threatened to swallow everything. Paramedics quickly tended to the injured before transporting them to nearby hospitals. Initial responders were shaken, but the sense that something was off lingered long after the stretcher wheels rolled away. Police soon realized the burglary explanation didn't hold. No footprints in snow, no forced access, no clear path for an intruder. As detectives began piecing together the night's events, the home that had once sheltered a family now felt like a puzzle of silent rooms and unanswered questions. And one truth was already emerging. Whatever had happened inside those walls had not come from the outside. But who had made that first call, and why? Before the quiet of that December night, before sirens and suspicion and allegations, they were just kids. Children with simple routines, simple joys, and dreams no one would ever see fulfilled. Eliana Ellie Wentz was born on July 2, 2014, her 9th birthday marking another summer full of laughter and light. A third grader at Odyssey Elementary School, Ellie was known for her boundless energy and bright smile. Teachers said she was loved by classmates for the way she cared about others and always seemed to be in motion, her little legs carrying her from playground to classroom with the kind of effortless enthusiasm only a child can truly master. Her younger brother, Aden Wentz, celebrated his 7th year of life on March 15, 2016. In first grade at the same school, Aden had a contagious sense of wonder, the sort that made small things feel enormous. A butterfly in the grass, a new crayon color he hadn't used yet, a storybook with pictures he could point to again and again. They were inseparable. Neighbors described the two of them laughing together in backyards, helping with small chores, and calling out greetings to familiar faces as they walked the sidewalks near their home. Elderly residents would recall how Ellie and Aden would wave with such sincerity that it felt like the sun had risen a little brighter that morning, a simple act that made routine days feel warmer. On school mornings, their backpacks, colorful and worn at the seams, waited by the front door, ready for another day of spelling tests and playground laughter. In the evenings, their mother would call them in for dinner, their voices echoing from the backyard like the soundtrack of ordinary life that never seemed unusual or fragile. They loved holidays. Ellie was especially excited for the winter break that year, not just for presents but for cookie decorating and holiday movies with her older sister. Aden looked forward to building snowmen and showing off his coolest snowball throw to anyone who would watch. Their father, Kevin Wentz, spoke of their dreams with a tenderness that flickered through community statements after the tragedy. Ellie wanted to be a teacher one day, just like her favorite third-grade instructor. Aden wanted to explore the world, to see mountains and oceans and deserts, and to name the rocks he collected along the way. They were children rooted in routines. They had beds with their favorite blankets, walls with pictures of family vacations, and futures no one dreamed would end that night. And then came December 18, 2023, a date that, hours before, was indistinguishable from any ordinary Monday. Dinner might have been spaghetti or chicken nuggets, homework left on the kitchen table, questions about what to watch on TV afterward. Nothing in those quiet moments, suggested what was about to unfold. In the days before, there was laughter in the living room, backpacks leaning by the door, and whispered sleepies as bedtime stories were read in voices too tired to be anything but loving. They had no way of knowing that would be the last time their routines would run uninterrupted. This is the point where most people stop watching, right before the truth gets uncomfortable. If you don't want the real story buried under silence, subscribe and stay. They didn't know that night would rewrite their names into headlines, or that the lives they had just begun would end before dawn. And in the school hallways, in the soft fabric of their backpacks, in the empty spaces where their laughter once lived, the loss became personal. Not just news. Not just tragedy. But something irrevocably human. Kimberly Singler and Kevin Wentz were once husband and wife. They married on June 4, 2011, in Greeley, Colorado, starting what should have been a lifetime together. Over the next few years, the couple had 3 children, born in April 2012, April 2014, and July 2016, each arrival celebrated as a new chapter in their shared family story. But by April 7, 2018, that story had begun to unravel. On that day, Kimberly and Kevin filed for divorce. What started as a separation slowly grew into a messy, contentious process. In September 2018, the divorce became heated with allegations of domestic violence and child abuse, claims the court found to be unsupported after testimony and evidence were weighed. Custody became another battlefield. By late 2023, just weeks before the tragedy that would tear the family apart, the tension was rising again. In October 2023, Kimberly obtained a temporary protection order against Kevin, alleging he had threatened her with a knife, a claim later rescinded by the court for lack of evidence. Around the same time, judges were adjusting parenting time, expanding Kevin's custody and scheduling supervised exchanges at police stations. On December 16, 2023, Singler was ordered to bring the children in for a routine custody transfer. But she never showed. No calls. No messages. And by December 18, a judge had issued an emergency motion granting law enforcement assistance to enforce the parenting order, a motion filed hours before anything horrific occurred. The morning after those custody court actions, Singler called 911, claiming a burglary had taken place and that someone had attacked her family. Police initially treated her as a victim. But the house didn't tell the same story. There were no footprints in the snow leading up to the patio door she said the intruder used. Those details made officers' heads tilt. Something wasn't adding up. She told police that her ex-husband had once dreamt about killing his family, and that he must be responsible for what happened. Investigators later checked his GPS records, and found he was about 80 miles away, driving a truck at the time of the killings. But the questions didn't end there. In interviews later reviewed by detectives, The surviving 11-year-old initially echoed her mother's claims of an unknown intruder. Yet as the evidence stack grew heavier, DNA on the bloody gun, the lack of forced entry, inconsistencies in timing, the story began to crack. Details emerged that would normally be in a public affidavit, but were sealed by court order, kept out of sight as investigators dug deeper. And when police began to reconstruct the timeline, the narrative Kimberly Singler offered motorists and neighbors began to unravel in a way no one had anticipated. Because now, the question wasn't just what happened in that house. It was who stood to gain from telling the story that first night, and why that story didn't make sense at all. Cases like this fade when people look away. Subscribing is how these children are remembered, not reduced to headlines, not forgotten. And by the time detectives reached the final piece of physical evidence, they realized not all mysteries are solved by what's found. Sometimes they're uncovered by what's missing. By December 23, 2023, barely 4 days after the bodies of 9-year-old Eliana, Ellie Wentz and 7-year-old Aden Wentz were found in their Colorado Springs home, a deeper question was dawning on investigators. Where was Kimberly Singler? Hours after the massacre, first reported as a burglary, Singler had been treated as another victim. She and her injured 11-year-old daughter were taken to a hospital after officers arrived at the scene shortly after midnight on December 19. At first, there was no reason to consider she might be anything but a survivor. But then she stopped showing up. On December 23, as the homicide investigation grew more intense and detectives began to doubt the original intruder claim, Singler simply vanished. Her vehicle was gone from the family's Palomino Ranch Point apartment. Her last known sighting, near the hospital, became the final lingering trace. No public ticket records were released, but law enforcement would later confirm that Singler fled the United States and crossed the Atlantic, arriving in the United Kingdom in late December, less than a week after the killings. Police began working with federal agencies to trace her movements through travel manifests and border check. Instead of surrendering to Colorado authorities on the extradition warrant issued December 26, she was arrested by the UK's National Crime Agency in Kensington, West London, on December 30, 2023, almost a full week after she disappeared from American soil. In the days after the disappearance, questions began piling up. Who was looking after the 11-year-old in her absence? Police declined to identify caregivers publicly, only saying the child was placed into medical care and later into protective custody. What was her alibi for the days she was unaccounted for? Singler maintained connections through legal representation in the UK but offered conflicting narratives about why she traveled and what she intended. Why London? There was no clear family link or documented employment that explained her choice of destination, and investigators on both sides of the Atlantic wondered whether she had planned her departure in advance, or simply fled into familiar territory. At her extradition hearing in Westminster Magistrates Court, Singler's defense argued that returning her to Colorado to face possible life without parole, if convicted, would violate European human rights standards. But the judge rejected that claim, allowing deportation proceedings to move forward. Yet even as legal battles stretched into 2025, one question remained unanswered. What was Singler doing between the final moments in Colorado and the moment UK authorities found her? Because the timeline, the disappearance, the transatlantic flight, the silence, suggested something far more calculated than panic. And somewhere in that hush, the real story was beginning to surface. After Kimberly Singler vanished from Colorado in the days following the deaths of her children, law enforcement went quiet for a moment, a silence that was far from calm. Investigators tracked her movements through domestic travel records and international alerts, but nothing prepared them for what came next: an arrest on foreign soil. On December 30, 2023, Just over a week after the bodies of 9-year-old Eliana, Ellie Wentz and 7-year-old Aden Wentz were found shot and stabbed in their Colorado Springs home, officers with the UK's National Crime Agency located and arrested Singler in Kensington, West London, an upscale neighborhood far from her Colorado life. At first, nothing about London was familiar to American investigators. Why had she crossed the ocean? There were few answers. No public evidence of family ties there. No known passport records suggesting she intended to settle in the UK. Instead, detectives were left piecing together border crossings and hotel stays as their American case stretched into a global puzzle. Inside the UK court system, Singler's situation shifted from fugitive to accused still fighting back. In Westminster Magistrates' Court, she appeared before a judge seeking to block her extradition, arguing that facing life without parole in Colorado would violate European human rights protections. Her defense team included Edward Fitzgerald, a London barrister known for defending high-profile extradition cases. Fitzgerald's argument was meticulous. His client faced a mandatory sentence in the United States that, under European standards, could breach protections against inhumane punishment. But prosecutors, backed by U.S. law enforcement, countered with a simple legal reality. The gravity of the charges meant Singler's fate should be decided in the jurisdiction where the alleged crime occurred. In January 2025, Judge John Zani ruled that Singler could be extradited, dismissing the human rights claim and passing the case to the UK Home Secretary to finalize. Singler still had the right to appeal to higher courts, and she did. Months passed, with Singler lodged in a British facility, her days marked by legal filings and courtroom appearances, her nights spent waiting for decisions that would determine whether she would be sent back to face American justice. Each brief hearing added new layers. British prosecutors presented evidence they believed made extradition appropriate. Defense attorneys questioned the voluntariness of statements given by the surviving daughter during the early days of the investigation. And behind closed doors, appeals were filed and denied, first to the magistrates, then to courts higher still. By late 2025, after months of courtroom wrangling, Singler's extradition fight was finally resolved, but not how she had hoped. The UK courts rejected her case and cleared the way for her return to the United States. On December 23, 2025, nearly 2 years after she first disappeared, Singler was flown back to Colorado to face the charges that have haunted her name ever since. Yet even as she stepped off that plane in U.S. custody, one fact lingered in the minds of both British and American investigators. Across thousands of miles, a question still hadn't been answered. What was Singler thinking during those days on the run, and did her time across an ocean change anything about the way the truth would finally emerge? The story was far from over, and the next revelation would be the one that pierced every remaining doubt. When officers first walked through the Colorado Springs apartment on December 19, 2023, the crime scene didn't look like a random break-in. There were no broken doors, no shattered windows, no sign that someone had forced their way inside. That detail alone was the first clue investigators used to question the original intruder story. Inside, the layout of the rooms and the placement of objects told a disturbing story. At the center of the living room, near where children's toys once lay, officers found a handgun, the same type later determined to be the murder weapon. Forensic examiners carefully photographed the scene, documenting the gun's position and the surrounding evidence before anything was moved. The weapon itself was standard. A small-caliber handgun, not a strange or unusual weapon that an outsider might carry during a random break-in. It was the kind of gun a homeowner might legally own. That detail mattered because it suggested the weapon belonged inside the home already, not brought in by an unknown stranger. Investigators also noted blood spatter patterns on the floors and walls. Trained forensic analysts look at these patterns like detectives read clues. Blood droplets in specific directions and shapes can show how a person was positioned. In this case, the blood evidence showed the victims were struck at very close range, consistent with someone standing near them at the moment of attack, not something scattered randomly by a struggle with an intruder. Photos from the scene also showed toys and books in their normal places, not turned over or scattered. In a real burglary or chaotic fight, those items would likely be out of place. The fact they weren't showed that no one had been running around the apartment before the violence occurred. Detectives also found shell casings from the handgun, laid out in a straight line near the bodies. Each casing marked a bullet that had been fired. Forensic specialists matched those shell casings to the gun, a process similar to matching fingerprints. In simple terms, the gun fit the holes in the walls and the wounds found during autopsies. Another crucial detail was the lack of defensive wounds on the victims. When someone fights back against an attacker, they often have cuts or bruises on their hands or arms from trying to block blows or grab at the weapon. In this case, the absence of those marks told investigators the victims had no chance to defend themselves before they were shot. All of these pieces, the handgun already inside the home, the careful placement of objects, the close-range blood patterns, the shell casings matching the gun, and the lack of defensive wounds, began to form a picture that didn't match the original story of an unknown stranger breaking in. At every turn, the physical facts refused to support the burglary explanation. This is where answers start slipping through cracks. If you want to see what investigators uncovered when no one was watching, subscribe, because disappearance is where truth either dies or gets exposed. Then came another revelation. DNA on the weapon matched someone already inside the home. That critical piece of evidence tied the tool of the crime directly to someone who lived there, not to a stranger passing through. The evidence didn't just point investigators away from the intruder theory. It began to show a pattern of actions that only someone familiar with the victims and the environment would naturally make. And when forensic analysts compared every piece, from the blood patterns to the fingerprints, from the shell casings to the lack of forced entry, one stark truth emerged. This wasn't a crime of chaos. It was a crime of choice. But even as the physical clues gathered like pieces of a puzzle on a table, one question remained unanswered, a question that contradicted everything the original caller had said that night. If no intruder ever entered the home, then who exactly was telling the truth? And why did the evidence refuse to lie? After years of uncertainty and legal maneuvering, the case of Kimberly Singler finally crossed continents and returned to where it began, Colorado. But even then, what remained was far more than just paperwork and courtroom drama. It was the echo of lives forever changed. In the months before the December 2023 killings, Singler and her ex-husband, Kevin Wentz, had been locked in a bitter custody battle stemming from their 2018 divorce and disputes over parenting time. In September 2023, Singler even obtained a temporary protection order claiming that Wentz had once waved a medium-sized kitchen knife at her during an exchange, an allegation he denied in court, and which a judge later declined to enforce. What you're about to hear is why investigators stopped giving her the benefit of doubt. If you're still here, subscribe, because once you see this part, you can't unsee it. That knife claim would resurface again, but in a very different context. When the bodies of 9-year-old Eliana, Ellie Wentz and 7-year-old Aden Wentz were found soon after midnight on December 19, 2023, Singler initially told police a burglar had broken in. She also suggested, without evidence, that her ex-husband might have been involved. Investigators quickly disproved both notions. There were no footprints in the snow near the supposed entry, and GPS data showed Wentz was driving a truck nearly 80 miles away at the time. As the investigation unfolded, the story told by Singler began to unravel. The surviving 11-year-old daughter, initially repeating the intruder narrative, later told authorities a far darker account, one that directly contradicted her mother's words. Prosecutors presented testimony that Singler told her children that God had told her to do it and that their father would take them away, a claim that crystallized the gap between the initial narrative and what the evidence suggested. Meanwhile, the legal battle over custody had been intensifying just days before the killings. A judge had ordered Singler to allow her ex-husband additional parenting time around the holidays, with exchanges scheduled at police stations. Singler failed to comply, leading to an emergency motion by Wentz's attorney to enforce the orders. A status conference was set for December 20, 2023, mere hours after the alleged murders occurred. Singler's fight did not end with her arrest overseas. Her defense team in the UK, led by Edward Fitzgerald, argued that extraditing her to Colorado to face a mandatory life without parole sentence would violate European human rights law. In January 2025, a British judge ruled she could be extradited despite this, and a final appeal was rejected later in November 2025. On December 23, 2025, nearly 2 years after the deaths of her 2 youngest children, Singler was flown back to the United States to finally face the justice system she had fled. In Colorado's 4th Judicial District Court, the charges against her are stark and all-encompassing. 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Eliana and Aden. 1 count of attempted first-degree murder related to the attack on the now-teenage survivor. 3 counts of child abuse. 1 count of first-degree assault. All of it laid out by prosecutors who have said the evidence, from crime scene analysis to witness testimony by the surviving child, points directly to Singler as the perpetrator. And yet, even as Singler sits in custody, awaiting preliminary hearings and future court dates, one hard truth lingers. A truth that no ruling, no sentence, and no legal motion can ever fully explain. Why had a mother, someone who had fought for custody, brought her family to the brink of destruction instead of a court order? Because in the final account, what remains is not just what was done, but what was lost, and why nobody saw it coming. And as the courtroom doors close behind her, the question still hangs in the air, unanswered, uncomfortable, and deeply human.